Hello, everyone, and welcome to the March webinar provided by CDI. My name is Michael Mathis. I am the Client Services Director at CDI. And did you know Laserfiche has a new API? Today, we will show you how to begin integrating Laserfiche using the new application programming interface. We'll see what the Laserfiche API is, how to search the repository, import and export documents, and so much more. During today's webinar, if you do need help or have any questions, please post your questions into the questions box at any time, and we will have staff monitoring questions during the webinar. We will also have time at the end of today's webinar to go over any additional questions that you may have. If you need help during the webinar, raise your hand and we can unmute you. And some tips for success during today's webinar. Take notes and screenshots during the webinar. I like to note how far into the webinar we are so that I can look that up quickly and easily after the webinar as well. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Post your questions in the questions box at any time, and we will have time for questions at the end. Please complete the survey after the webinar. We love hearing your feedback and your ideas for future webinars. And remember that this webinar will be recorded today, and you'll be able to watch it again on our YouTube channel within a few days of the webinar. Today's consulting webinar is, did you know Laserfiche has a new API? And the intended audience for today's webinar is Laserfiche administrators and software developers. If you are neither a Laserfiche administrator nor a software developer, please stay in the webinar. There will be a lot of valuable information for everyone today. The agenda for today's webinar. First, we'll provide an overview of the Laserfiche API. We'll go through differences between the Laserfiche API and the Laserfiche SDK. We'll review available features in the Laserfiche API. We'll discuss a few use cases. And finally, we'll look at a live demo. So what is the Laserfiche API? The Laserfiche API is a set of secure RESTful web APIs that allow you to interact with Laserfiche Cloud or Laserfiche self-hosted repositories. So what is a RESTful web API? A RESTful web API, which stands for Representational State Transfer, I had to look that one up, is a fancy way of saying it's a API that you interact with over HTTP web requests. The API is language agnostic and can even be used through a web browser itself. The Laserfiche API provides online interactive API documentation using Swagger. Swagger is open source and interactive documentation. The documentation will show you all of the inputs and outputs from the various API methods, and will also allow you to send requests and view the responses directly through your web browser. The Laserfiche API also has various libraries and sample projects available through Laserfiche's GitHub website. These include various API utilities to make it easier to integrate with the Laserfiche API in various programming languages, as well as UI components to quickly and easily create new custom web applications to integrate with Laserfiche. The Laserfiche API has been available for Laserfiche Cloud and is now available for Laserfiche self-hosted environments. You must be on Laserfiche server version 11 And you can download the installation and view the installation guides at developer.laserfiche.com. The Laserfiche API is identical between self-hosted and cloud environments. There are just a few key differences. Authentication in the self-hosted Laserfiche API uses a username and password, whereas Laserfiche Cloud is going to use the OAuth 2.0 protocol to handle authentication. In the Laserfiche self-hosted API, volumes can be selected when creating new entries, whereas Laserfiche Cloud does not utilize volumes. And finally, the deprecated APIs for Laserfiche Cloud server sessions are not available in the Laserfiche self-hosted API. So what's the difference between this new API and the Laserfiche Toolkit, or SDK, which we have had available since version 7, if not longer? One of the key differences is with licensing. The Laserfiche API is included with your Laserfiche server licensing. If you are licensed to have a Laserfiche repository, you are licensed for the Laserfiche API. The Laserfiche Toolkit, or SDK, is available separately as a module add-on. If you would like to purchase the Laserfiche SDK or learn more about the Laserfiche SDK, please reach out to your Laserfiche account manager, and they will be happy to assist. The Laserfiche API, as a RESTful API, is agnostic of your programming language. You can program in any language and still be able to utilize the Laserfiche API. The Laserfiche Toolkit, however, provides libraries for .NET, Java, and COM, so you need to program in one of those specific languages. The Laserfiche API provides a higher level API. That means more functionality is included in one request. However, you have less functionality available in the Laserfiche API. The Laserfiche Toolkit is lower level, where the SDK is a lot more flexible and provides a lot more integration functionality with the Laserfiche repository. However, it's much more difficult to use in that you need to learn a programming language and write a program from scratch with the Laserfiche SDK. And finally, the Laserfiche API provides open online Swagger documentation. So you can view that API documentation for Laserfiche Cloud or for your self-hosted API at any time, whereas the Laserfiche Toolkit provides a proprietary locally installed documentation file, and that documentation is not allowed to be distributed. Some key features of the Laserfiche API: we are able to create new folders in our Laserfiche repository, where we can create and define our folder structure dynamically through other applications. We can write field values to our Laserfiche entries. So in addition to being able to create folders, we can assign metadata to those folders that we've created or to documents that exist in our repository already, or to documents that we are importing. We have the ability to import and export documents. And there's so much more available through the Laserfiche API, such as assigning tags or links, getting dynamic field values, and even performing searches within your Laserfiche repository. A use case for the Laserfiche API would be searching for documents. So our accounts payable department would like the ability to view documentation and metadata for invoices in Laserfiche for the invoice record they are currently viewing within their accounting system. By utilizing the Laserfiche API, an integration can be created to search the Laserfiche repository for that documentation, and that data returned from the Laserfiche API call can then be used to display that information within the accounting system. We can create documents and metadata through the Laserfiche API. So for example, the Human Resources Department would like to use their HRIS software to automatically send documents that are generated to the Laserfiche repository automatically through the HRIS system. Using the Laserfiche API, an integration with the HRIS system would be able to send those documents generated from that external system to the Laserfiche repository through the API, apply the appropriate metadata, and save that document to the appropriate location. Thirdly, we can integrate our Laserfiche repository into a custom application. So a custom application has been created for internal use. This application interfaces with various other systems already, and the use for the application will be expanded to include information from Laserfiche. Using the Laserfiche API and the Laserfiche UI components, we can quickly and easily add UI components and functionality into our existing application to browse our Laserfiche repository. We can view and edit metadata on documents in our third-party application, and so much more quickly and easily through that Laserfiche UI component library. This has to be one of the things I am the most excited about in this Laserfiche API. At this point, we will jump into our live demonstration. So to get started, we will open the Laserfiche developer website at developer.laserfiche.com. And here we can see our quick and easy, frequently used topics being displayed. So we have our link to getting started, a link to our step-by-step instructions on using the Laserfiche API, a link to the various libraries that are able to be used with the Laserfiche API. And finally, we have our Laserfiche API server, or the self-hosted Laserfiche API information. Clicking on Learn More here will bring us to the self-hosted Laserfiche API server documentation. And this will provide you with the information needed on how to download, install, and use the Laserfiche API server for self-hosted systems. It details the prerequisites for the Laserfiche API server. Under the installation steps, we have a link to download the Laserfiche API server. It provides us with the 5 quick and easy, surprisingly easy, configuration steps for configuring the Laserfiche self-hosted API. And finally, some information for verifying and troubleshooting the installation. At the end, we have authenticating with the self-hosted Laserfiche API. And this provides information on how to generate a session token to use to call the Laserfiche API. If we go back to our developer page and we look at our libraries available, we can see we have API client libraries for JavaScript or TypeScript, .NET, and Java, as well as links to documentation and the sample projects available. And finally, we have our link to our guides, and this is where we can find the information specific to the Laserfiche API and the methods available. Authenticating to the Laserfiche API will provide us information on how to create a connection to the API. We can authenticate to the Swagger Playground, which is going to show us step-by-step how to authenticate to interact with that Swagger Playground. And finally, we have our Laserfiche apps libraries that we can use, and this includes our JavaScript utils, a resource library, as well as the link to the Laserfiche UI components. At the bottom, we have documentation for all of the various API calls that are available. So we have information for creating folders and getting folder contents, assigning our template fields, updating values, assigning tags and links, performing searches, and importing and exporting documents. The Laserfiche API uses the Laserfiche licensing available to your Laserfiche users. So for Laserfiche Cloud authentication, you can create a service principal to authenticate users, or you can authenticate using the Laserfiche OAuth API to authenticate a specific user and have them log in using their Laserfiche user license. For self-hosted installations, the session token is going to be generated using a username and password for a named Laserfiche user. There are options available for using a Laserfiche Integrators license, and more information on additional licensing types available through the Laserfiche API can be sent to your Laserfiche account manager. For the Laserfiche self-hosted API, we will go to our URL. So that's going to be the server name / Laserfiche repository API by default. And this is going to bring up the Swagger documentation for the Laserfiche API. As we scroll through our documentation, we can see we have the ability to get user attributes. So this API method is going to return the attribute key value pairs associated with the authenticated user. We can interact with entries. So our delete method here will delete an entry. We have a method that will move and or rename an entry. The Swagger UI documentation is very user-friendly. It provides all of the information that you need in a clear and easy to understand way where you don't even need to be a developer in order to understand what this API is capable of doing. If we expand our section here by clicking on it, we can see more information. So this is going to move and or rename an entry. We're going to move and or rename an entry by passing in the new parent folder ID or name in the body of our request. And we have an optional parameter available to auto rename our entry. So if an entry already exists with the given name, the entry will be automatically renamed. The API documentation provided is so clear and easy to understand. You don't need a computer science degree to be able to work with the Laserfiche API. It is wonderful. If we continue scrolling down, at the bottom here we have our token methods. And here we can request an access token to the Laserfiche repository. I am using a self-hosted installation here. If I click try it out, I am then able to fill in my repository ID. And since I'm using a self-hosted Laserfiche API environment, I must use a password grant. My username is going to be my Laserfiche username. And the password is going to be my Laserfiche user password. If I click on execute, this is going to send my request to the Laserfiche API. And at the bottom here, I have my short-lived access token. Here I'll highlight everything and copy that token. And now if we scroll all the way up to the top and click our authorize button, we'll paste our token in and click authorize. And now we're able to send additional authorized requests to our Laserfiche API. So here, if we want to return a single entry object, we can again try it out. I'm going to go to my demo repository. My entry ID is going to be 1 because I know that is the ID of my root folder. And if I execute my request, this will then provide me that full request URL along with the server response. So here I can see for my root folder, my parent ID is 0, my full path is a /. My repository was created in 2014. Ooh, I'm dating myself a little bit here. And our entry type is a folder. Super duper. Let's do something a little more fun than just getting an entry. We can create a new folder within that root folder using the return, delete, move, return fields. Saw this 20 minutes ago. Here we go, creator creates a new child entry in a folder. So here we'll provide our, we'll try it out. We'll provide our repository ID. Our entry ID will create a new folder inside of our root folder. And let's auto rename this folder. For Swagger API, documentation will automatically populate the default request body for us. So here we can change our entry name to CDI March 2023 webinar. And when I execute this request, we have a successful response coming back. And we can see that we have our new entry ID, 251973. Our name is CDI March 2023 webinar, as well as all of the additional information returned by the Laserfiche API. If we log into our Laserfiche repository, sort by our creation dates, or by our name, and we have that did get created in the root folder. There it is, CDI webinar. And we have nothing in our folder so far. So let's come back. We're going to copy our entry ID. So our new parent folder is going to be the folder we just created. And here we'll create a folder named New Folder with a smiley face. Execute our request. And here we have our information saying that our request was successful. We have all of our information here. If we go back to our Laserfiche repository and refresh, here you can see we have our new folder. Now that we know how to create folders in our Laserfiche repository, we can come down towards the bottom here, and we can create a new document inside of the folder that we had just created. So again, we will try it out. Our repository ID will provide our parent entry ID. Our file name is going to be live webinar upload.pdf. And we will automatically rename this entry if needed. And finally, we are going to choose our file to upload. So here I'm going to select a PDF from my computer. And we will populate the template name. Again, this is going to pre-fill information for us, and we will then be able to easily edit and adjust this information. So here our template is client documents. Our first field is client name. Our value is going to be my name there. Property 2, document type, is our second field. This is going to be an invoice. And we won't be setting any additional properties, so we will delete this section here. Sample 6, this is a very important file. So we are going to take this as important. I can't tell you enough how important sample 6 truly is. We won't be assigning any links, and we will be using our default volume. Now, if we execute our request, you can see we have our successful response. We have our operation of entry create. It gave us our new entry ID. Our document was set with no exceptions. Our template of client documents was assigned with no exceptions. We had 2 field values set with no exceptions. We tagged this as important with no exceptions. And it provides us with a link to the URL that we can use to retrieve information about that document. If we go back to our repository and refresh, here we have our document. We can see it was tagged as important. If we look at our fields, our template is client documents. We have our client name populated and our document type populated. And finally, if we look at our very important document, here we can learn how to browse in Laserfiche. Next, at the bottom, we can then search in Laserfiche, so we can run our search in the specified repository. We will try it out using our demo repository. And here we can specify our Laserfiche search command using the Laserfiche search syntax. So here I will say LF, drawing a blank on my search syntax here. So if we log into our repository, let's go under search filters and we will build our search through here. I'm going to remove all of those. We'll add our filter for tag. Select OK. We will say with all important. And we'll view our search syntax. There we go. We'll copy that back to our API. Paste in our search syntax. When you have quotes in your search syntax, they do need to be escaped in this documentation by putting a backslash in front of that quote. Finally, we will execute our search. And here we have our response with our search token. We will copy this search token. And we can use the next method here to get the status of our search after we start that search. So we'll enter our repository ID and our search token. Here we can see our search is completed. And finally, we can get the results of our search by providing our repository ID and our search token. We have additional optional values we can provide, such as a list of field names that we want returned or field values we want returned. And if we execute our request, this pulls back our search results, and here we see live webinar upload.pdf with the creation date and time of today. And finally, we will take a look at the sample projects for Laserfiche, as well as the documentation for their custom components. So with the Laserfiche UI components, we are able to quickly and easily add existing Laserfiche UI components into a custom application. Here we can see we have our Laserfiche template and metadata available, where we can add or remove fields and update our metadata on documents through a custom Laserfiche application. Or I'm sorry, it doesn't have to be a Laserfiche application, any application. These components support Chrome, Firefox, and Edge. And the API documentation provides information on how to get started, how to use the components inside of a Angular application, as well as how to convert your Angular components to an element so you can then use these outside of an Angular application. Many UI components are provided. For example, we have our Laserfiche login dialog. This will then allow us to sign into Laserfiche. And it brings us to our Laserfiche development environment login. We have access to the breadcrumbs. So this is the breadcrumb list up at the top of our Laserfiche repository. So very similar to what we have here. Whoops. We have our LF checklist. They provide us with a toolbar that we can use, and a Laserfiche repository browser. So here we can add in a browser to browse through our Laserfiche repository. We also have access to the Laserfiche field container, where we can set metadata or view metadata on documents. And this is very well documented to detail all of the different configuration options available as you are adding this into your custom application. That will conclude the live demo portion of our webinar today. There are many resources available for the Laserfiche API. We have the developer.laserfiche.com website, the Laserfiche API server documentation, the Laserfiche GitHub website, as well as the interactive documentation for the Laserfiche UI component library. Additional resources for Laserfiche include Laserfiche Answers, the Laserfiche Solutions Exchange, the Laserfiche Support site, and the CDI YouTube channel. If you do have additional questions, please feel free to contact us at consulting, sales, or support info@citiesdigital.com. And at this time, we will be available for any questions that you may have. And I do see that we have some questions in our questions box. One question is, the demo for self-hosted is great. What about cloud-based? The Laserfiche API and everything that I showed for the demo today is just as valid in cloud as it is for self-hosted. We have a question, would a new folder still be created automatically if we are creating an entry at a non-existent file location? The Laserfiche API is going to require the Laserfiche ID number for the parent folder. So you would have to use the API to verify all of the parents in that path do exist. For licensing to authenticate users in the cloud, do they use full licenses or participant licenses? I believe participant licenses can be used to authenticate to the Laserfiche Cloud API. However, all permissions and security configured within your repository is going to be enforced through the Laserfiche API. So for example, if we are trying to delete an entry through the Laserfiche API and we don't have delete permissions, we won't be able to perform that action through the API. We would get an error response. We have a question, is this independent of any Laserfiche application versions? The Laserfiche self-hosted API is available for Laserfiche Server 11 or higher. We have a question, are you aware of any plans for Laserfiche to build a UI component library for .NET Core? I haven't heard of anything for that. However, I would absolutely love to see that provided by Laserfiche. We have a question, will there be any information on this at Empower? Yes, I believe they will have information about the Laserfiche API at Empower, and we would absolutely love to see everyone at Laserfiche Empower this year as well. Right, are there any additional questions? I will stay on for just another minute or two if there are any other questions. And again, please remember to fill out the survey that will be sent out after today's webinar. This webinar will be available on the CDI YouTube channel within a couple of days. And again, thank you very much, everyone, for attending today's webinar. If you do have any additional questions that come up, I always think of my best questions right after the meeting. Please don't hesitate to reach out and ask. We love to hear from everyone. Thank you again for joining us for today's webinar. Enjoy your day.